he's a political military analyst. He specializes on the Middle East conflict, war on terrorism, deterrence. He's an authority.
Yeah, right now it is.
He, he is, excuse me, he's an authority on Hezbollah, Hamas, fighting terrorists. He's published articles in the Washington Times, National Post of Canada, the National Interest, National Review, Front Page Magazine, many other sources. He is a recognized authority. He was a member of rescue teams in the aftermath of the bombing of the Taba Hilton in 2004. He was in Gush Katif in Gaza in the summer of 2005. He has taught as a visiting endowed chair, Bornblum chair at the University of Memphis. He has many other accomplishments to his credit. Is most recently in Gaza on the ground. He was called into Gaza. He's a major in the IDF reserves because of his expertise, his knowledge of the situation. He's a longtime friend of mine, and without letting it go to his head, he's about the most astute analyst of this situation that I personally know, and I know a few. So please welcome Elliot Chodoff.
Thank you, David. What I want to do is sort of bring us up to date on what's going on as best I can. Let me start by saying, while this isn't off the record per se, what I'll be saying is entirely my own analysis, projection, some of it based on hard analysis, some on soft analysis, and quite frankly, in this business, some of it on what I call tea leaf reading, which is essentially applying whatever background knowledge we have to a situation and projecting forward. Let me also start by saying that we're in a situation that has no parallel in Israeli history and possibly not in world history. And one of the things that I did in my month or so with the Gaza division was try to impress upon the regular army and reservists that the paradigms and models that we've lived with over the years, for the most part, don't apply anymore. And we have to essentially synthesize from our experience and our background and our knowledge in a completely new situation that at least Israel has never faced. Now, let me try to break down what that means and how we get to where we are today. October 7th was a monumental failure for the IDF. And it was a failure across the boards. I'm not going to belabor the point because I want to move forward. But the important point here is the ideas, the concepts, the doctrine, the operational methods, the intelligence concepts all failed and failed massively. In other words, this wasn't a situation where, and this happens in war and in battle, where the enemy outmaneuvers you. You did things right, but the enemy did things better. Here, everything failed. And having said that, to its credit, the IDF bounced back very quickly. The government made some very good decisions, including mobilizing reserves in massive numbers and deciding that we were at war and moving those reserves both to the north and to the south. That's background. With that, the Army, or the IDF, the Army, Navy, and Air Force, were given two missions in the grand sense, and then in a narrow sense, two more missions. The grand sense was to deal with the enemies to the north and the south. We're facing Hezbollah along the northern border, and that's a war that is ongoing, although static, and I'll come back to that in a bit. And with Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iran along the northern border, but hold that for a moment. And of course, in the south, the mission to defeat Hamas and to rescue the hostages. Now, those two missions, defeat Hamas and rescue the hostages, many people have written are diametrically opposed. They're not diametrically opposed, but they don't necessarily work in conjunction with one another. They're parallel missions, but as very often is the case when you have parallel missions, you have to prioritize. And the prioritization of what is more important, defeating Hamas or rescuing the hostages, is an ongoing debate that continues to this day in Israeli society. There was a fear initially going in, it was a fear that I didn't share, that the IDF was not up to the fight in dealing with Hamas in its own home urban setting. I've got a great deal of criticism with the IDF, and I'll say a few words about that as well, but it is a highly professionally, well-trained, well-organized, highly motivated force. And over the past few months, we've seen the result of that in that essentially nonstop victory from the day the operation began, and even from prior to that when the bombardment began, but certainly when the ground operation began in Gaza. The first stage of the attack, and I'm not going to use a map here because Gaza is easy enough to understand without a map. Gaza is a long rectangle, and in that rectangle, the rectangle goes from northeast to southwest. So we'll talk about north, center, and south. The northern part of Gaza is Gaza City with its neighborhoods and suburbs. The most notorious neighborhoods, Jabalia and Sejaiya, suburbs of Bet Hanun, Bet Lahia. The central area is much more rural, with a couple of towns, villages, refugee camps. Here again, most notorious El Bureid, Nusayrat, and Bet Hanun. And the southern part of the strip, with two other major cities, Khan Yunis and its neighborhoods, and Rafiah along the Egyptian border. So again, think of a long rectangle, Gaza City in the center, rural area in the Gaza City in the north, rural area in the center, and Khan Yunis and Rafiah in the south. The first part of the operation was to separate Gaza City from the rest of the strip. That was done with a drive into the central rural area from the Israeli border to the Mediterranean, with a penetration along the coast, essentially cutting Gaza City off from the rest of the strip. And during that period, in an attempt, which was largely successful, to prevent and limit non-combatant casualties, an order given or a directive given for the Gaza population to move southward into what we're calling today humanitarian zone along the beach near Khan Yunis and Rafiah. And a good number of those people actually did that. They moved out. Interestingly enough, there's a background to this that I'll sort of bring up continuously. The UN and the United States condemned the Israeli directive for the civilians to leave the combat zone, even though the Geneva Convention explicitly directs an attacking force to direct non-combatants out of the combat zone into safe areas. In other words, the United States and the UN and the Europeans essentially condemned Israel for doing precisely what is mandated by the Geneva Convention. This is something that's going to come up over and over again in my talk. With a good part of the civilian population moved out, the Israeli ground forces moved in, and in essentially three prongs, moved into Gaza City proper, and Greater Gaza, and in the course of about 6 weeks of fighting, essentially destroyed Hamas's military capability above ground. Now, the above ground here is critical because in Gaza, a 65-kilometer long strip, there is an estimated 800 kilometers of tunnels. And tunnel fighting is its own world, it's its own doctrine, and it's its own danger. But in the meantime, the above ground military force of Hamas, which in the north was made up of 2 brigades of some 14 battalions, was smashed, and brilliantly so in combined operations of Israeli infantry, armor, and engineers with air and artillery support. And I'm just going to say this as an aside. Every Israeli casualty is a tragedy, and I'm not going to belittle them. But our numbers at the moment look like, we don't have 100% estimates on enemy casualties, but look like we have lost fewer than 200 men in the maneuver, and we've killed over 10,000 terrorists in the process. So the numerical ratio is way, way out of proportion, given that urban fighting tends toward 1-to-1 in casualty ratios. In other words, you lose 1 for every 1 that you kill. So if the ratio is some 200 to 10,000, it shows how well the IDF is doing, and quite frankly, how poorly Hamas is doing. Involved in that fighting was the taking over of hospitals, very often described as attacks on hospitals, which it was not. The hospitals, for the most part, kept operating. In some cases, like in Shifa Hospital, kept operating because the Israeli military sent doctors and nurses into the hospital to make sure it would keep operating, even while the Israeli troops were going through searching for terrorists and finding not only evidence of terrorists in the hospital, but an underground network of tunnels beneath the hospital, going through their security cameras and finding that the hospital had been a conduit for hostages that were taken on October 7th, moved through the hospital and down into the tunnels. And here I have to state explicitly, the Geneva Convention, once again, states very, very clearly, hospitals are protected areas, but not if they're used for military purposes. They lose that protection the moment they're used for military purposes. And the world simply refused to accept that. They said, well, so they moved a few hostages through there. So they had some ammunition, they had some bombs, and there were some terrorists. That doesn't make it a military target. Well, yes, it does, according to the Geneva Convention. With all of that, the hospitals were left operating, they were assisted, and they're still operating to this day. I'll leave for a moment why there are more hospitals in Gaza with 2 million residents than there are in some Arab countries with 10 times that number. Almost every other building, I'm exaggerating, is a hospital. In addition to that, of course, UNRWA camps, UNRWA schools, UNRWA installations were being used by the terrorists. As we know today, as the US, Britain, Australia, Italy, Finland, and a few other countries have cut off financial support for UNRWA because its members actually took part in the terrorist attack on October 7th. UNRWA, which is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, a humanitarian organization, 95% of its employees are Palestinians, and a good number of them in Gaza, a significant number of them are Hamas. So attacks on UNRWA facilities, which were condemned, of course, by the West and the UN and so on and so forth, and to everybody's surprise, found rockets and bombs and ammunition and that sort of thing in those places, and entrance to tunnels. That was also very much part of that operation in Gaza initially. What we didn't find in Gaza were many hostages. And the reason for that is because part of the underground tunnel network included conduits from Gaza City across through the rural areas of the center and into Khan Yunis. Khan Yunis is now the center of military operation. And most likely where the Hamas leadership is, Yahya Sinwar, Mohammed Def, the other leaders of Hamas, underground, below Khan Yunis. Khan Yunis is the home of both Sinwar and Def. It's the hard core of Hamas. And the IDF, for a variety of reasons, including American pressure, but also for tactical reasons, is operating very slowly and very methodically in Khan Yunis in order to close it down, lock it down before we begin the operations in the tunnels. Now, it's no secret that one of the issues, of course, in the tunnels is the hostages. The Hamas leadership has surrounded themselves with hostages as human shields. By the way, the number that's being touted as the number of hostages being held by Hamas is certainly high, and it's an open question of how high. In other words, over 130 are listed. The best official estimate is slightly more than 100 are still alive. I personally believe that that's an optimistic number, but I'm not going to mark an absolute number. Nobody really knows. But they're being used primarily as human shields around the leadership, which precludes a massive Israeli assault on where the leadership is, and requires a much more careful, methodical work in terms of locking down the center of Hamas in Khan Yunis. Last but not least in operations is the city of Rafiah, and this is an actually extremely problematic one because Rafiah is along the border with Gaza. The edge of Rafiah that with Egypt, the edge of Rafiah that borders on Egypt is a road that is codenamed Philadelphia, but the code is known by everybody today. So what is known as the Philadelphia Corridor, under which today there are some 12 tunnels that Hamas is operating between Egypt and Gaza, both for bringing equipment, ammunition, supplies in, and the possibility, and this is something we don't know for sure, of getting the leadership and hostages out and out of the reach of the IDF. One of the great fears that we have is that they will get hostages out into Sinai and from there to Iran and make them impossible for us to reach. Egypt is being uniquely uncooperative and has said that if we close the corridor, which is along their border, they've threatened as far as breaking diplomatic relations with us and reneging on the 1979 peace treaty. How serious they are is an open question, but it gives an idea of the complexity of the situation. So that's the grand in the Gaza area. Additional side notes. Hamas, in preparation for all of this, dug an enormous number of its rockets into pre-targeting underground launch positions. In other words, think of 6, 8 rocket launchers in the ground, only their mouths, the exit point of the rocket sticking at the edge of the ground, so very, very difficult to find unless you trip over them. Already loaded with rockets, prepared for launch by pressing a button, calling a cell phone, and sending them off. The good news is that they can't reload them. The further good news is that we're finding them, many of them still with the rockets in them. In other words, they will never be launched. The bad news is that we haven't found all of them. And even today, as far into the operation as we are, they're still launching rockets into Israel. Now, at this point, frankly, they're more an irritant than a real massive threat, but they're enough of they're deadly, so they're enough of an irritant to get people to have to go into shelter, shut down life, and keep people living in fear. And of course, a good part of the population from the south in the area of Gaza will not return home under the circumstances of threat of those rockets. So that's one thing that's going on. Second, it's important for me to mention that with all of the credit that I give the IDF in its operations and its coordination, there are things of concern going on as well, and they need to be noted. Three major errors over the past couple of weeks. The first was the IDF spokesperson, Admiral Hagari, stating we have destroyed Hamas's military capability in Gaza City. You never say you've destroyed the enemy's military capability until they've surrendered. And Hamas, in order to show that it wasn't true, immediately launched a series of attacks in Gaza City and launched rockets out of Gaza City just to show that the statement was false. So on one level, it was correct. We did break up their military structure. But what's happened in Gaza City and is happening repeatedly across the Strip is that as we have destroyed that structure and as we've taken over the territory, we're moving less from an assault, attack, advancing mode into a more static holding territory mode, which by virtue of being static allows the initiative to shift over to the other side. And we're beginning to see more and more sporadic, call them guerrilla style attacks, but Gaza City is not secure. It is simply under our nominal military control. So that was one mistake. The second mistake was pulling forces out of areas that we'd already taken. The areas had been declared secure. We no longer needed forces there. And of course, with an underground network of tunnels, there is no secure. The next day, the terrorists fired 40 rockets at Ofakim, just to let us know that, no, it's not secure. And the Golani Brigade that had been pulled out of there was moved back in there. Surprise, if you leave it alone, they're going to move back into it. Last but not least, the tragedy of last week of the 24 soldiers who were killed. When it first happened, I raised eyebrows. Just full disclosure, I'm, among other things, I'm a certified demolitions expert from the IDF. And when these two buildings blew up under Hamas rocket fire because they had been prepared for demolition already, and the demolitions blew up when Hamas fired the missiles into them, the first question I asked was, why were there so many guys in these buildings when they're prepared to be demolished? And the answer is because they weren't following procedure. And this is, again, a consequence of long-term in battle. These are guys these were reservists who've been in battle now for a couple of months. Exhaustion, sloppiness, and lack of discipline. And the report came out, there were 24 killed, 3 in one incident, 2 in a tank. So there were 19 who were actually killed in the two buildings. 14 of the 19 should not have been in the building. But they were there, frankly, because it was raining outside. And that lack of discipline concerns me because that's the stuff that leads to high casualties for no reason whatsoever. Casualties are an element of war. There's no escaping them, but there's unnecessary casualties, and that was a case of them. So that's sort of the general overall picture in Gaza. Moving north, we've been fighting a hot, static campaign with Hezbollah. Today, just like any other, I live in the north, not along the border, but if it's quiet and the wind is not too strong and it's moving in the right direction, I hear the artillery fire from my house. The planes are going overhead all the time. Hezbollah is working as hard as it can to stay in the game. They certainly don't want to have happen to them what we're doing to Hamas in Gaza. But at the same time, they're not going to let northern Israel live quietly while we're beating up Hamas. The chance of this escalating at this point is extremely high. I'm not making predictions, but extremely high, in part because we're not letting them get away with it, and they need to keep escalating, although they're doing it very, very gradually. My belief is that they're going to reach a point where they cross the line, and we're going to have to go in and go after them. I'll make two more comments and then open to questions. One is the Houthis in Yemen. I've been speaking about them for years. People never quite understood why everybody is so concerned about a bunch of people in Yemen. Now everybody understands something that I've been saying for years. Yemen controls the entry to the Red Sea. The Red Sea is the entry to the Suez Canal. It is one of the most important maritime commerce routes in the world, and Iran is now in control of it via the Houthis. Nobody's been paying attention. America, Britain, and other countries for whom maritime commerce is critical have basically been taking it lightly. Even now, with America and Britain stepping up their attacks against the Houthis, they're doing it in a very, very mild, minor, symbolic way, and the Houthis are not impressed. They hit another ship today. And until the world understands, and I keep reminding my American friends in decision-making positions, the U.S. Navy was created to fight pirates under Jefferson, the beginning of the 19th century. This is piracy in the high seas. If the U.S. Navy doesn't fight pirates, it has no reason to exist. And at the moment, it's not really doing it. It's trying to send them messages. Last but not least, the world, and I can't not relate to the South African genocide claim in the International Court. It's indicative of where the world is today, that Israel, which was attacked by a genocidal terrorist organization that states clearly in its charter that its purpose is to wipe Israel out and to wipe out the Jewish people, Israel's defense against that is considered to be genocidal. And here, I'm not an alarmist, but we are seeing echoes of Nazi-style logic that live Jews deserve to die. And the International Court didn't completely rubber stamp it, but instead of simply throwing it out, they said, well, you know, there is some justice and justification to the claim. Now, the numbers can be in dispute. The accepted number of Palestinian casualties is 24,000 today. Those numbers are provided by the Hamas Ministry of Health. Hamas is not exactly the most reliable source for information. But even if I take their numbers at face value, and from that 24,000 subtract the 10,000 terrorists that we've killed because they don't differentiate, for South Africa and the world to say that this is the most devastating war in human history, and this is the most devastating bombing in history, without anybody even saying Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Tokyo, Dresden, Berlin, London, and to simply take it at face value, and those are the simple ones, shows that the myth of Israeli genocide, of Israel committing genocide, simply stands without even the slightest question of looking at the facts. The other statement that 90% of people starving in the world today are in Gaza is true if 2 million is 90% of 300 million. Now, I don't know arithmetic that well, but 2 out of 300, and that's assuming that everybody in Gaza is starving, because the population there's 2 million. The UN claims there are 300 million people in starvation in the world today. So how 2 million becomes 90% of 300 is also a very, very interesting kind of a case. But again, let's not confuse ourselves with the facts. So I say all of this because this is part of the background of world policy. It's part of the background of American policy. It was unofficially announced today that the Biden administration is considering cutting back resupply to Israel of weapons and ammunition in order to limit Israel's capability of inflicting damage. So that's where we are at the moment. And to quote Telly Savalas at the beginning of Kelly's Heroes, and on top of all of that, it's raining. It's been pouring all week. They expect it to be pouring into the coming week. For us, it means higher heating bills. For the guys, the hundreds of thousands of guys who are out there in the field, it means being cold, wet, and miserable on top of everything else. So that's our situation. With that, I'll stop and allow you to ask questions. I saw some people wrote in chat, but if somebody could read those for me rather than have me punch into my phone, I'll be happy to do it.
Thank you. Excellent as always. Yes, we have a couple of questions. One is from Juliana. She says she wants to thank you for your briefing, your report, and she's asking, what are your thoughts on the Iranian drone attack in Jordan on the American base in the northeast of the country?
Iran has been at war with America since Khomeini came to power in 1979. It expressed it directly with the bombings of the American embassy twice in Beirut, the American Marine barracks in Beirut by Hezbollah. And here, let me state unequivocally, Hezbollah is not a proxy of Iran. Hezbollah is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Quds Force of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards. In other words, they take their orders from Iran. So Iran and America have been in war, as I said, since 1979, 1980. America doesn't recognize it. Iran knows it. And here we can now fast forward to Iranian drone attacks on American bases in Iraq, in Jordan, the Houthis attacks on American ships in the Gulf. None of this is new. As long as America absorbs it and shows weakness in the face of it, Iran will continue to do it, because that's how it works in this part of the world. I should say it's how it works in most of the world. And the Iranians are expert at it. The Americans are showing weakness, and weakness is something to be exploited, not something to be accommodated.
Yes, good. We have another question related from Jonathan. He's asking for some background on the Houthis and why have they been on your radar for so long?
Okay, so the Houthis are a sect of Shiites. They're rebels in Yemen, and they're on my radar for so long because the Iranians have been backing them from the very beginning. And when the Iranians are backing someone, I come from a school of thought that asks why. Now, sometimes it could be Napoleon once said that sometimes you do things just to irritate your enemy, and it could be nothing more than that. But a look at the map, and you know, I'm an infantry officer, so it pains me greatly to expound on naval strategy. But a look at the map will show you very quickly that the Iranians do have a global naval strategy, and that includes control over major maritime routes. Now, they already have great control of the Straits of Hormuz, through which a good part of the world's oil flows. And by backing the Houthis, who are in the southwest portion of Yemen, it was clear to me that this would give Iran ultimate control over the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb, which of course are the entry into the Red Sea. When you consider that the Iranian Navy is also operating in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, you begin to understand there's that Suez Canal thing. It means that they will essentially be controlling or trying to control 3 of the 4 great choke points of major maritime commerce in the world. They're thinking grand strategy, and you only have to look at the map to see it. Most people don't, and I include American leaders and strategic thinkers who are looking at the Yemen civil war as something local. The American administrations were actually pressing Saudi Arabia not to get involved against the Houthis because it was escalating tensions in the area. They had it backwards.
Yeah. Yes. One more question from Jonathan. Can you talk about the status of the hostage negotiations? Do you foresee any progress or any release in the near future?
There's talk going on. Frankly, you're dealing with Hamas, who you can't trust at all. In other words, they'll make a deal and break it the next day. They'll come close to a deal and then raise the ante the next day. In my opinion, Hamas is going to hold out for an end to the Israeli military operation and a withdrawal from Gaza, because anything less than that will not serve their purpose. But we'll see. They may come to other terms. If they have a way of escaping, they might be able to soften. Way too dynamic to really make a prediction.
Esther and Wayne, I want to ask about what is the level of unity among the Israeli citizens? There are reports of division within Israel. I mean, of course, news reports are news reports.
Right.
So
not related to truth.
You live there. So what are you seeing?
Look, Israeli society is more unified today than it's been in the decades that I've lived here. There is a protest movement that is a mix of people who are genuinely concerned for the hostages and those who want to get rid of the government and are using the hostage situation as a lever to do that. In my personal opinion, they're making a strategic error. I think the whole movement that calls for bring them home is using the wrong terminology. It puts the onus on freeing the hostages on the Israeli government, where in fact the call should be let my people go and be directed at Hamas. Now, that doesn't absolve the Israeli government from negotiating, coming to terms, and coming to a deal and getting them out. But the idea that that somehow everything in the country, the country's entire existence, needs to be pawned or mortgaged for the release of the hostages is strategically wrong. And Netanyahu made a statement yesterday, which I think was ill-advised but correct, and that is that these demonstrations actually strengthen Hamas and strengthen its negotiating position. But having said all of that, the reserve call-up, the response to the call-up, the fact that we're months into it, and only in Israel will you see reserve soldiers protest for being sent home before the job is done.
The pro-war protest. It's not the anti-war
protest, but pro-war protest by the soldiers who've just been pulled off the battlefield.
Yeah. Susan has a good question. In fact, I was wondering about this myself regarding the tunnels between Gaza and Egypt. Now, I know, and you know, that al-Sisi is no lover of Hamas or Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas is Muslim Brotherhood.
Correct.
And he doesn't want these guys in on his soil, does he? I mean, so
No, he doesn't want Hamas on his soil, but he will happily let Sinwar and friends transit Egypt to go to some five-star hotel in Qatar.
yeah, yes. Um, yeah. I'm tempted to talk, but I want to get to questions. We have another question from Jonathan. Is Netanyahu's judicial reform on hold, back burner, in light of the Gaza war?
Yeah, totally on hold. Even while it was going on, the Supreme Court slapped down one of the laws. Now, with a war cabinet, it's not exactly a unity government, but a war cabinet. Anything specifically partisan is simply not on the agenda. Uh, if they can ever get it back up and running, is an open question. It was. Let me say this delicately. It was a subject that needed to be addressed, and it was addressed in the most politically inept way possible. And now certainly it has no chance of getting back into operation as long as the war is going on. My light just went out. Let me turn it back on.
David, we have a question from a member of the live audience.
Yes.
Mr. Chodoff, I have a question about how bad Israel depends military from America. If Biden will stop it, and how Israel will react on it, and if they able to fight without this help. Just this is the question.
Thanks to incredibly bad decision making over the past decade, which included all of the lead up into what happened on October 7th, we are absolutely dependent on the United States. We cut back our physical capabilities. Just to give you an idea, we once had 4 attack helicopter squadrons. Now we have 2, and we're begging America for helicopters, and they're saying no. We cut back on our own production and stockpiling of artillery and tank ammunition, knowing that America would always resupply us if necessary, except that America is now balking on resupply. So we are, at the moment, I don't want to say more dependent on America than ever before, but as dependent on America as we ever have been in the history since our dependency on America, which dates back to the early 1970s.
Stan, we have other questions from on site there.
Yes, we do.
Please go ahead.
My question is about the West Bank. What is the IDF doing to keep the peace in the West Bank from escalating?
We're not keeping the peace. We're attacking terrorists all across the West Bank. The West Bank is, contrary to popular belief, heavily infiltrated by Hamas. There's the myth that the West Bank is Palestinian Authority and Gaza is Hamas. That's not exactly true. Although, frankly, Fatah and the Palestinian Authority are equally involved in terrorism today as Hamas is. The difference between them is that since 2002, in Operation Defensive Shield, Chomat Magen, we reestablished our security and intelligence presence in the West Bank in a way that we did not in Gaza after Oslo. And I want to emphasize, after Oslo, not after the disengagement. Okay, in other words, our detachment from the Palestinian side of Gaza dates back to 1994-95, not 2005. And that's left us essentially blind and incapable of operating in Gaza. We did the same thing in the West Bank, but went back in 2002. So what we're doing today is much more, call it classic counterterrorism operations, going against specific targets. The operations are real. In other words, the fighting is intense, but it's very small scale by comparison. And one of the things that we learned back in 2002, and those of us in the business have known forever, is that terrorist organizations have a very hard time being defensive and offensive at the same time. And as long as we keep the operations up, it makes it very difficult for them to launch terrorist attacks. So we're staying on top of them, basically. I don't want to say that in absolute sense. It doesn't mean it's impossible. It doesn't mean they won't get any of them going, but we're keeping it at a very low level because of intensive pressure.
I see another question in the chat from Don. That's if the Americans don't provide Israel with the weapons that they need, will they go elsewhere, like maybe to Russia?
Not really, because you can't suddenly integrate another country's weapons into your system. Keep in mind that the reason we use American ammunition is because our weapons are geared for American ammunition and not for Russian ammunition. Our electronics are American, not Russian. Our aircraft, our helicopters are American, not Russian. So say, just for the sake of argument, our primary attack helicopter is the AH-64 Apache, the American helicopter. We can't suddenly shift over to Russian helicopters. We don't have the spare parts. We don't have the mechanics. We don't have the logistics. It would take years to make the transition.
David,
Not that we could trust the Russians.
No. Yeah. Stan?
Yeah, another question from the member of the live audience.
Okay.
Thank you so much for very informative session. I do have a small question to demolition expert of IDF. When you blow up entry points into the town and an exit point from the town, how does it leave the tunnel, not being able to be used again and again, given the fact that they can repair entries and exit points and provide ventilation and so forth? Thank you.
Okay, so first of all, the demolition is done to depth. In other words, it's not just closing the top of the shaft. There's always a difficult decision to be made in going down into the tunnels. Let's keep in mind, these are not simply tunnels. They're multi-layer tunnels, some of them going down 10, 15 stories below ground. And within them, blast doors, booby traps, all sorts of things to make life difficult and dangerous for the people going down into them. So the decision is always based on the specifics of the location. How far into it do you go? But as far in as we go, we destroy everything from there back. So it's not just, let me try to describe it this way. There's a horizontal network of tunnels, and there's a vertical network of shafts that lead up and down through the tunnels. We're not simply destroying the shafts, we're destroying the shafts and down into the tunnel itself, making it very, very difficult for them to get back into them. Keeping in mind as well, we're not exactly allowing them to move equipment into these places anymore. Their ability to rebuild or to renovate, as long as they're there, is virtually nil. Now, if we pull out within a few years, I'm sure they'll be able to put it all back together again.
Thank you. We have a question from Dan about the aid package to Israel and Ukraine held up in Congress. Israel must be following that pretty closely.
I find it outrageous.
So
Um,
it must be affecting their ability to prosecute the war, right?
It is. It
Yeah.
is, absolutely. I find it outrageous. And here, let me be clear, and I'll step out into a bit of a political minefield here. I'm in favor of supporting Ukraine in the war, not because I'm a great fan of Ukraine, but because it's my belief that very often you choose sides in a war not based on your friends, but based on your enemies. And Russia, Putin's Russia is the enemy of the United States. So, having said that, tying aid for one to aid to the other is unconscionable. Each one should stand on its own merits. And
Yeah.
the idea that either side, any side, and I'm not going to come down here and Republicans or Democrats, it doesn't matter. Tying Israeli aid to Ukraine, tying Israeli aid to southern border security in the United States is unconscionable morally. It's also poor strategy. So you don't support one of your friends because somebody else won't support another one of your policies.
I'm hungry. Would you like me to make you something?
Yeah. Well, there's a question about the relationship between Russia and Hamas. Russia has a relationship with Iran, right?
But let's look at this globally for a moment. Russia, Iran, and China are the core of an axis. You want to call it the axis of evil? We can call it the axis of evil. They are the core of an axis. They are supported by North Korea and Venezuela and others in the periphery. People were surprised a couple of weeks ago when it was announced that we found North Korean weapons in Gaza. I wasn't surprised. North Korea has been shipping weapons to our enemies for decades. China is supplying Hamas. I found Chinese weapons in Gaza in 2002 when I was there.
Yeah.
This is a Chinese AK-47 magazine. I picked it up from somebody a couple of months ago who didn't need it anymore. Russia is part of it. Iran is supporting Russia in the war against Ukraine. Russia is supporting Iran. Russia announced last week that it's flying patrols along the Syrian-Israeli border to prevent Israel from interdicting Iranian supply of Hezbollah. What more do you need?
Yeah.
David, we have another question from a member of the live audience.
Yes.
Elliot, thank you so much. I would like to take the opportunity to introduce myself. I'm honored. My name is David Barnett. I'm honored to be the new rabbi here at Congregation Nishmat Am. First and foremost, I want to thank you and Jerry and Stan and Bill for having the connection so specially with you. We are so honored and grateful for your up-to-date analysis and information here, and we truly appreciate it, and we can't thank you enough. Following upon the questioning from a previous lady here, and based upon what you said, I'd like to know your perspective on what the possibilities would be of Israel being able to become more self-sufficient in terms of setting up new manufacturing for military hardware and things, so as to not be so dependent upon the United States. What would be the timeline of the ideal progress in that area? And even more importantly, is there a movement within Israel right now to begin that process?
So, excellent question. The answer is yes, it's already begun. We have manufacturing capability and it's being stepped up, but war being what it is and being the voracious consumer that it is, requires stockpiling. In other words, the Israeli production will never keep up with the needs of an ongoing war. So even though the decision has already been made and things are being stepped up, and I'm sure that over the coming year or two it'll be stepped up even more, we're behind the eight ball. We're the ammunition, tank and artillery ammunition that we are firing today did not exist in Israel on October 7th. And as much as we can now, chip into or break into a bit in terms of increased production, the only way to stay ahead of this is to have a huge amount stockpiled. And here, as I said, it was part of the whole concept. We don't really need to worry about this anymore. We can get rid of attack helicopter squadrons. We can cut back on tank brigades. Who needs all that stuff? We have electronics. We have computers. We have sophisticated fences, in case it's not obvious the sarcasm of my believing that all of that is nonsense, and proven to be the case on October 7th. You can't really catch up, or let's put it this way, a country like Israel cannot catch up. The best we can do now is mitigate, wait for this is over, and then build up in anticipation of God forbid, the future, but we have to be prepared for that. Israel is not the United States that can turn a massive civilian industry, if necessary, into a massive military industry, as was done in 1942-43. But we're changing the production schedules, and B, we're already talking about reopening the 2 helicopter squadrons. Eventually, I imagine America will supply us. The question is whether we'll do it in a timely fashion for this war. Producing more tanks to build up another tank brigade, lengthening reserve service, which had been cut back drastically over the years. In other words, there is military force capability in Israel that was intentionally allowed to wither over the past decade as part of the concept of we can buy these guys off. They're really not that dangerous. What is there to worry about?
Thank you so much.
We
I
have
have
time. Yeah, go ahead.
What's the end game here? I mean, is this the talk of the 2-state solution going to go anywhere? How do we resolve this?
First of all, we resolve it by smashing Hamas as an organization. We're not going to smash Hamas as a concept. Radical Islam isn't going away, and I think the best analogy that I can give is that in May 1945, Nazi Germany was destroyed. Nazism was not, as we well know today. 2-state solution, if there's a partner, if there's another side, the 2-state solution is predicated on a premise that so far has proven to be false, and that is that they'll be satisfied with their own state without wanting to continue to destroy us. Abu Mazen, our partner for peace, stated today that he condemns the countries that are cutting off aid to UNRWA because UNRWA is critical to the Palestinian demand for its right of return to Palestine. That's Abu Mazen, not Yahya Sinwar. Okay, in other words, our partner for peace, who's going to lead the peaceful 2-state solution, today stated that the primary goal of the Palestinians is the return of the refugees to their homes from 1948. So who do we have to talk to?
Yeah. I think we're coming up to the end of our hour.
Okay.
Stanley, is there anything else that you need to put in here?
Yeah, the very small question, gentlemen.
Okay.
Go.
In your experience in this last 3 months in Gaza, how many Palestinians you saw that were welcoming IDF?
0.
Thank you.
Yes. Well, on behalf of Nishmat Am congregation, Elliot, thank you. Thank you all for tuning in. I'm sure Elliot lived up to my introduction. As I said, he's probably the most astute analyst that I know. He's someone who can make a complicated situation understandable. He has a great talent for that. He's a great teacher. I've worked with him as a colleague in University of Memphis. He's been a professor at University of Haifa. So Thank you, Elliot. You and I will be talking very soon.
Very good.
So, thank everyone. And
Thank
also,
you.
blessings. Be safe. Elliot, you be safe. Okay.
I'll try.
All right. Thank you.
They should worry about being safe when I'm
Yeah.
around.
Let them build the fence, right?
That's right.